Live from the sun-drenched cobblestones of the Eternal City, conversations crossing faith, culture, and current events. Civil discourse, civil debate, and the free exchange of ideas. This is Intersections with Bree Dail and Joey Meugniot. And now your hosts, Bree and Joey.
Good morning from the Eternal City. It is very, very warm here on this Monday morning. Intersections, crossing faith, culture, and current events. And we're having a bit of technical difficulties. Good morning again. For those of you joining us for the first time, I am an internationally accredited journalist, including accreditation to the Holy See as the Rome correspondent for the Epoch Times. And you may also find me on National Catholic Register and other outlets. And I am joined by my ever intrepid host, Joey Meugniot. Good morning, Joey.
Good morning, Bree. Yeah, it's definitely warm today. It is sweltering. This weekend was incredibly hot. It was like 90 degrees for those of us that use Freedom units. For the rest of the world, if you happen to be listening, it was close to 40-ish degrees Celsius. So it was pretty warm. So yeah, there's a lot of news to go over. We're going to jump into that shortly. My name's Joey Meugniot. I'm a political advisor and analyst. And we are going to kind of break down some of these stories, give you some insight, some of our opinions, and a lot of facts around some news that's happened over the last week and what you can look forward to for the coming week or so. So Bree, as we do every show, let's get us started with some news, and we're going to talk about some faith news first, right?
Right. So our show is always broken down into three themes, or we try to do that: news impacting faith, and that impacting politics and current events. And when we have time, we'll also discuss how it impacts culture. And so this week, some of the breaking news, bottom line up front, impacting the church. So Pope Francis responded to a letter that was sent by Cardinal Marx 2 weeks ago. We discussed that last week. Cardinal Marx of Germany resigned or offered his resignation to Pope Francis. Pope Francis very quickly responded in very, very humble tones, as we can say, to Cardinal Marx, denying his request to resign. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to throw some analysis into that. And then Cardinal Zen of Hong Kong issued a very even-toned message in support of the traditional Latin Mass community. That's due to some unsubstantiated rumors. And when I say unsubstantiated, I truly mean there are no substance, some substantial evidence to support the rumors. There's just right now reports coming out of certain facets in the Vatican who are claiming that the Pope is either going to abolish or make some changes in the Summorum Pontificum. And Cardinal Zen issued this really even-toned support of the traditional Latin Mass, while he makes it very clear that he's also very much in support of the Novus Ordo, which is the new Mass, what most people go to in their vernacular in the English language or in Chinese or whatever that national language is. And in support of Vatican II, which many individuals who are involved in the activism in the traditional Latin Mass community also place a lot of the blame on some of the abuses in the Novus Ordo, the new Mass, on Vatican II. So he really makes this even-tone message, and you can find that. I tweeted it out. I put it on Facebook. His Eminence took my translation from the Italian and placed it onto his website as the official translation as well. And then, Joey, also what came out this week, or this past week, was Moneyval, which is an independent, like third-party oversight, financial oversight group, issued an assessment of the Vatican Bank and Vatican finances. As we know, out of the Vatican in the last few years, we've been seeing a lot of reports of financial corruption. And they issued a report, and they said that this has been improved by Pope Francis's move to consolidate, liquidate assets, consolidate, and really focus investigation into the financial corruption. And they say it's been improved, but they still have issued concerns on ensuring justice is upheld. So even if they find the financial corruption, has justice actually been upheld? And then finally, Joey, the Pope issued a statement today on the World Day of the Poor. And I'll talk about, I went to the press conference. I'll talk about my questions for Epoch Times and what occurred at the press conference. And then I know you had a ton of questions on the document itself. So going back and circling back, Joey, we're going to hit real quick. The Pope's response to Cardinal Marx. What did you get as someone kind of outside looking in, especially as we saw that Cardinal Marx really placed upon his shoulders responsibility as a leader in with regards to hiding, or not hiding, but cover up of sex abuse. He said he could have done more. He's a leader, and so he took that on his responsibility. And we discussed last week, Joey, the changes in canon law and where there's punitive action now associated to not reporting sex abuse. So what were your thoughts when you read the Pope's response?
Sorry, I had to mute myself even quicker that time. So here's the Pope basically said thanks but no thanks. That's really what he said. But that's me kind of reading between the lines a little bit. He thanked him for his courage, so positive, and then he, in so many words, said like, nope. You're gonna ride this one out with the rest of us, and you're gonna continue serving. You're gonna continue doing all the things you did before. And if you want to attack the crisis or help handle the crisis or move us forward as a church, you're gonna do it in the position that you're in now. So, good talk, and send him back out on the field. That was pretty much how I read that. So, it's funny that it happened so quickly, but in reality, it didn't. So we found out about his resignation, like 2 or 3 weeks after the fact. And the Pope,
yes,
like his response was within a couple days, maybe. He had, once it became public, it then took a couple days to do that. But in reality, he had several weeks to craft this and figure out exactly what they were going to say. And I think this isn't over yet. I think there's going to be some more back and forth between Cardinal Marx and Pope Francis. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out with all the other things that are going on in the world and within the church. And I think you're seeing really, we've heard stories throughout the centuries of, cardinals and bishops arguing back and forth with the Holy See. And we oftentimes get the abbreviated version just due to the fact that, it happened 3 or 4 or 5, 1,000 years ago. I think we're seeing that play out in real time right now. So this is going to be interesting to see where it goes. Now, will it have a lasting historical impact? That remains to be seen. But we are seeing this kind of political back and forth, these movements. It's kind of like watching a chess match, really. But it's happening, and this is what it looks like. This is the political aspect of what happens at the Vatican. And I think this isn't the last we've seen of it, so we're going to continue to follow the story, because I find it a little interesting that how they're going back and forth about doing this. And with the other ramifications, I think that's really important to all Catholics,
right?
Especially when it comes
and especially out of Germany.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. It's especially out of Germany, because we do know that the personal relationship between the two individuals, actually really between most of the German hierarchy and the Pope, is quite strained. And that's due to the push by the Germans to really get the synodal way underway, and some of the changes that they're trying to make within the German church, i.e. the blessing of homosexual unions, the ordination of women, all of this that they've been pushing forward has received quite a solid blow by the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith in recent days. And that was signed by Pope Francis. And, there were reports and rumors, and this is one of the reasons why when we go into Cardinal Zen's issued statement, there were reports and rumors early on that the Pope was unpleased or displeased by the CDF document, saying, definitively the Church does not have the power to bless homosexual unions. And that was a response to the Germans. I mean, there's no question that this was a response to the Germans, and that the fact that the Pope signed it and he owned that document, that was questioned very early on, and there were indications from a blog here in Italy saying that he was going to walk back that support. It's the same blog that has been pushing out rumors with, with reference to Summorum Pontificum. So, which one of the reasons why I've said, like, let's stand by, because that never happened. The Pope never walked back his statements. And someone asked me the other day, Joey, how can I, as a journalist, like, not get emotionally involved with everything that's happening to the church? And you made a really solid point just now. You said, what would have been heard about, where we could discuss in historical sense, we're seeing played out in real time, and it is politicking. And I look at the 2,000 years of history and tradition, and it doesn't have, that is what's formed my faith, what is happening with individual people right now has no impact on my personal faith. I do find it really interesting with, reference to how people deal with this politicking. So, Joey, when we talk about Cardinal Zen and his statement, I know you're not really too much into this the inter-fighting, I would say, in the different rites, and but it is, I find it kind of interesting that here is a man who has really understood persecution coming out now in even tones and saying, hey, let's all kind of get together and realize that this is a good thing. The traditional Latin Mass is a good thing. And you've been to a traditional Latin Mass. Did you find it interesting?
I did find it interesting. That's it. The simple answer to that. I enjoyed it. But again, I like history, and I like the historical aspects of the church as well. And the other thing that I just thought of too while you were saying that was that, hundreds of years ago, this wouldn't have happened on Twitter and with emails back and forth. So like this kind of drama is happening actually in an expedited fashion in comparison to history, where it would have had to have been, they wrote a letter and then 3 months later they got there, and then 3 months later. So it took, 20 years for this back and forth. And I think we'll see a resolution to this sooner rather than later. But it is interesting to see the back and forth. And I do like when we talk about Cardinal Zen and the things that are going on there, because I don't think it gets a lot of attention or a lot of light. And it is important for us to have these discussions. Also, sometimes it's just take in the information, just take in, marinate, just kind of bask in the ambiance, because we heard stuff and it sounded like, the Pope's going to walk this thing back and this is what's going to happen, and it just didn't materialize, it didn't actually happen. So, just take in the information, kind of see what's going on, and then just kind of watch the cards play out and just kind of see how it all unfolds. That's the interesting part. So, especially when it comes to the Vatican stuff. So, yeah, that's it. So I know we've got a few other topics, and we're gonna jump to the break here in a little bit. So, Bree, what else did we want to touch on before we hit our first break?
Well, sure. So people can go ahead and take a look at the full report of Moneyball. So we won't go directly into that. I think, to me, and we might bleed over to the next segment, but and it is actually, you can connect the two. So I think we have an intersection here. But the Pope issued a statement on World Day of the Poor. Today is World Day of the Poor. And this is a very lengthy statement. It's on my Twitter and Facebook as well. And I was able to ask a question after all of this. But first, I would love to get your hot take on the statement itself, Joey. And I'm guessing we're going to bleed over to a second segment.
Yeah, we're definitely. I'm going to have to Joe McClain myself off the radio again. So, so it's really lengthy. It's multiple paragraphs, and there's so many hot takes out of this. There's so many things to look at and dig through. But I thought some of the interesting ones were that we wanted a different approach to poverty, and we'll talk more about that after the break. But really, what the first part that really struck me as a little curious was the message from the Holy Father about Judas, and that Judas is upset when they didn't sell the oil to help the poor. So we've got a few seconds here left before we come back, or before we leave. And when we come back, we will continue to talk about World Day of the Poor. We've got a few more stories lined up, and we will dig into analysis and some hot takes when we come back. So stick around for great fun and good times ahead. Thank you.
It's often said that people can engage in whatever sexual activity they please as long as it doesn't harm anyone. But is this a sufficient moral criterion for evaluating sexual behavior? I don't think so, and here's why. First, it begs the question against the natural law moral theory, since if the natural law approach is true, then sexual acts that the natural law condemns as immoral would be harmful to a person's moral character. Second, although it's true that we should avoid inflicting unnecessary harm, it can't be our only moral criterion. For if it were, then we'd have to say a person's intent to murder or rape someone is morally permissible as long as he doesn't carry it out. But that's absurd. Avoiding unnecessary harm is a part of a good moral theory, but it's not enough. I'm Carlo Broussard with a ready reason for Catholic Answers, Catholic.com.
Welcome back to Intersections with Bree Dail and Joey Meugniot. Sorry for that quite abrupt and confusing exit there. So really what we wanted to talk about with World Day of the Poor was this very lengthy, long message that the Holy Father put out. And if you have the time to read it, I do recommend going and reading it. It's pretty interesting and insightful. And what I had started to say is at the very beginning he talks, there's a passage there, and it talks about money, basically, and that Judas was upset that when the woman came and poured the oil over Jesus, that he was upset they didn't take the oil and then sell it to help the poor. And it's interesting that theme runs through the entire document. That there's a lot of talk about money, actually, and the poor. And I find that the Pope always tries to walk a fine line between lightly advocating for socialist programs or kind of that ideology and Christianity. He, as the Pope does, he's pretty good at it, but he does walk that fine line quite frequently. And the biggest issue is that the two aren't compatible very often. So now the other thing that I thought was rather interesting was that there's several sections there that talks about personal, I forget what he calls it, individualistic responsibilities or individualistic tendencies, things like that. And I find it interesting that we hear a lot about it being someone else's fault, right? There's no talk of personal responsibility for where you are in your life. And I find that to be just concerning. In fact, the
Pope actually made that point, is that
yeah.
I'm going to break in. There's a quote that I quoted on Twitter, and that he says, individualistic lifestyles are complicit in generating poverty and often saddle the poor with the responsibility for their condition. Yet poverty is not the result of fate. It is the result of selfishness. That, to me, was probably the strongest statement in support of what you were saying. Go ahead, Joey.
Well, I guess really the conversation comes down to, or at least the analysis piece, and it's worth further discussion, is whose responsibility or whose selfishness, right? So I think there's a lot of, we don't talk a lot about taking personal responsibility, and kind of this elite group of people that we listen to and that talk about things all the time say a lot about, it being someone else's fault. It's always somebody else's selfishness, somebody else's, thing. Now there is some personal responsibility. Sometimes it's not fate. Sometimes it's just but there are certain aspects that have to be acknowledged, that there are some personal responsibility to take in this. And it's always these kind of unnamed others that they refer to. It's somebody else's fault that you're in this particular predicament. And I think that if you pull at that thread, you're going to see it run through a lot of the topics we're going to talk through today, especially when we get into the G7 summit. So, and really, when I hear that it's somebody else's fault or that it's the selfishness, it means anybody that isn't, or anybody that disagrees with that particular train of thought, right? So it's anybody that the other people are whoever disagree with what, in this case, the Pope is saying. So if you don't think it's selfishness, it's probably you.
Joey, I want to bring up something that I posted a few days ago. Jordan Peterson was discussing this very topic in the way of groupthink, and the lack of reason, the lack of the use of critical thinking and this tribalism that takes place in saying it's someone else's fault. It's not about me. I'm not part of the problem. It's someone else's fault. And when I looked at the document, and there is mentioned democracy, and I know that this was a quote that you found very interesting. I'm going to let you bring out that quote from Pope Francis. But what I find interesting is that capitalism has been really seen as a bad thing in this pontificate, during this pontificate. And there are elements of capitalism that if not checked, can lead towards real selfishness and real just breakdown in moral values, right? But, however, when we take a look at what's going on down in South America, in the very areas that have suffered under this polarized viewpoint of economy, and Pope Francis has brought in this discussion on sharing, and this idea of when you have, you should give to others who don't have, which is Christian in its essence. And he brings out St. Paul's, discussion on this. So it's a Christian ideal, but it has been stolen and manipulated by socialism, because the foundation of the Christian ideal is that we are all brothers, and everybody recognizes that. So if you're in a family and everybody recognizes that you are, in that family, are family, right? There's a difference in how you approach things than individuals who are seeking to take, from the rich and give to the poor, this Robin Hood mentality, right? And what I find very fascinating about this, and I brought this into a question, and I'll let you go back to this because I think it's again all of this is very interesting to me on this World Day of the Poor. Is you brought up a topic off of the show when we were prepping for the show that I think is really essential with all of these, great, all of the rhetoric that has come out in the last, throughout this pontificate, discussing how we can approach poverty. We have seen some of the most wealthy individuals be brought into the Vatican, and yet poverty hasn't been addressed outside of individuals like Jeffrey Sachs coming and, who is an economist. He's world renowned out of the United States, and he is the proponent of population control to end poverty. And so, Joey, before I know this is a lot of information, and before I let you go back and hit some of these things, I do want to read the question that is going to be kind of the center of my report for Epoch Times. And I asked the head of this press conference today, who is in charge of the pontifical group promoting the new evangelization. But he was also, this archbishop also was at one time the president of the Pontifical Academy for Life. And so I asked him today, the Holy Father writes, the individualistic lifestyles are complicit in generating poverty and often saddle the poor with responsibility for their condition. Yet poverty is not the result of fate, it is the result of selfishness, unquote. Only a few weeks ago, the Vatican hosted a closed-door meeting on economy and ecology, and among the featured panelists was Jeffrey Sachs, who seems to be a frequent advisor to this pontificate and is known for his avid support of population control to end poverty. As it seems that there can be some confusion in messaging the engagement of the Vatican with a leading proponent of population control, and today's message that the causes of poverty should not be placed on the backs of the poor, will the Holy See be willing to make a definitive statement on this important day of whether it supports or rejects the notion of population control to end poverty? And you can imagine, I mean, this is a pretty poignant question. Can you just make a statement? Do you support it or are you against it? And yet the answer was a bit of a word salad. So Joey, as someone who's watching the Vatican, who is a recent convert, what would you have wanted to hear from the Vatican at this point, knowing that today is the World, Day of the Poor, and we just saw out of China, which is the largest state proposing, or that has propagated this whole idea of control of the population to end poverty or to keep everything in an equal balance. Now they have an issue with not having enough people to help sustain them economically, and so they're now pushing this away, this one-child rule, and now they're proposing having every family having 3 children. So all of this, Joey, let's do a breakdown, because I know that you also have some quotes out of this as well that you wanted to hit.
Okay, sure.
Sorry.
So there's a few things that stood out to me, additional things that stood out to me. So the quote that she was talking about earlier is that Pope Francis said that the very concept of democracy is jeopardized when the poor are marginalized and treated as if they are to blame for their condition. Some of the things that he says I agree with in principle, but when you unpack it or you look at some other texts that he's issued, like a few months ago, he said that individual liberties were, he was not a fan of individual liberties, which runs contrary to, Western thought for the last 250 years. So in this document that he put out today, he said that we need to have a different approach to poverty, and that governments and institutions need to be more involved. Okay, so what, more government handouts? Do we need additional NGO funding? What does that look like? A different approach to poverty? It sounds, and there's a lot of things that sound good, and you're like, oh yeah, it sounds really new. We need a new approach to poverty. We've got to, and you're going to see some themes jump out here. But he also said that there was new forms of poverty. I thought it was just poverty, the same old poverty we've had since poverty existed. But I'm curious now if we're going to start hearing about new forms of poverty, like climate poverty and social poverty and any other kind of new version of poverty they decide to throw at us to make us feel bad. There's a lot of, not to be super aggressive, but there's a lot of virtue signaling in this statement. It's really off-putting. And it's coming from an institution that has argued for the longest time that the Vatican has to possess wealth so that it can be used to do charitable work around the world. And we talk a lot about poverty, and but I just don't quite get the message here. So we're against individual liberties. We don't think last week talked about clerics that are doing individual things.
Rigid.
He doesn't like it.
Rigid.
Rigid individualism. He doesn't like individuals. And who else didn't like individuals? The Soviet Union. So I think that there's the other quote that stuck out to me, and then I'll give it back to Bree, was that poverty, on the contrary, should motivate us to creative planning aimed at increasing the freedom needed to live a life of fulfillment according to the abilities of each person. That's what he said. So if my ability is to create a business and jobs for other people to help lift them out of poverty, I shouldn't do that then? I don't understand what you want me to do. I really don't. I don't understand how you can say that we need to aim at increasing the freedom of individuals to live according, or do things according to their abilities. And then literally right before that, you said that we have to have a new form of, or there's new forms of poverty, and we need to rethink this. So there's a lot of conflicting messages in this statement once you unpack it. And if you look at it through the prism of previous statements, there's a theme running throughout of them. We don't like individualism. We only like freedom that sticks to the tenets that we want to propose, which is being involved, more governments and institutions being involved. And the last thing, Bree, that you touched on a minute ago, which was what we talked about before the show, was that he's had all of these rich, wealthy people and institutions and banks and financial entities at the Vatican for the last year.
Inclusive capitalism.
Inclusive capitalism. What are we doing? What is this? So capitalism can't fix it, but now we have to make it inclusive. So, I mean, capitalism is responsible for lifting more people out of poverty than anything else in the last 2,000 years. So now he advocated that we need to find a different approach to fighting poverty. Is there does he have an idea for it, or are we just going to let big banks and celebrities that he brings into the Vatican tell us how we should go about fixing poverty? I don't understand it. I don't get it. I think there's a lot of people that will read this and think something very similar to what I've suggested. But I mean, I think we don't need a new approach to poverty. I think we need to continue doing what we're doing now, and maybe take some power and some money away from some of these larger institutions that seek to hoard it from the rest of us. Instead of what it appears that he's doing is advocating for more of those people at the top to keep more of the money from the people at the bottom. And that's
one of
what
the
it sounds
things,
like.
Joey, that really drives home, other than the population control, you know, that to me there needs to be a definitive statement out of the Vatican because of the association with individuals like Jeffrey Sachs. But moreover, we have now seen in the last few years Pope Francis really making an effort to ensure that financial corruption is rooted out of the Vatican. It's an amazing job. He's done an amazing job on this. Yet, at the same time, we also know that some of that financial corruption impacted greatly programs that were supposed to be helping the poor. And most of those individuals who were donating to those programs were Americans. So, for example, during Lent, when you had those rice boxes and that coming, you know, children gathering up their money in order to support the poor through Peter's pence, that money was misspent. Instead of going, and Joey, I know we both are veterans. I tried to explain this the other day, and how much of an impact that is to the credibility of the Vatican to handle and deal with some of the poor, because there are so many beautiful religious organizations out there who are really doing amazing work, like Mother Teresa of Calcutta Sisters, right? But self-policing is really necessary, you know, and then the Pope has done some very, good, exposure. He's done exposure, and he's also fixed a lot of the issues that we have seen within the Vatican finances. But, you know, when you consider that Peter's pence or the Papal Foundation, this money that was donated to help the poorest of the poor, didn't get to them, it reminds me a lot of what happened with, do you recall what happened with Wounded Warrior program? You know, when there was an exposition that the people at the top were spending the majority of the money that was being donated by Americans who were wanting to help the Wounded Warriors coming back, and the Wounded Warriors were getting like a very small percentage of the actual donations. All of it was going to overhead and expensive trips. And they were utilizing the emotional heartstrings to try to help veterans in order to make that money. And do you recall what happened? I mean, I don't think Wounded Warrior ever really recovered from that exposure.
I mean, they still exist, and they still raise a lot of money. They fixed a lot of the problems that they had, but it was something like 10 cents of every dollar actually went to wounded veterans. And, you know, you bring up a pretty good point about the money aspect of it. And in the same statement today on the World Day of the Poor, I alluded to it earlier, but I'm going to read another passage out of it just to get the point across. St. John goes on to note that Judas said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. And as he had the money box, he used to take what was put in it. So I think Judas was the first virtue signaler. Like, I'm just going to say that now. He was offended and upset about this, not because he cared about the poor, but because he was taking the money from it. And I think that's an interesting analogy to put at the beginning of your statement. So, and then we'll talk about the G7 here in a little bit, because I know we're about halfway through our time here. So, you know, it's really fascinating Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So Adrian, our producer, just said Fulton Sheen allegedly called Judas the patron saint of social justice, which I could definitely see, because there's nothing more than being offended by the actions of others when really you're offended that you didn't get what you wanted. That's really where the offense takes place. So
that is a huge point, Joey, and I want to make this really clear to our listeners. That happens on both sides of the house. And I think the first thing you have to ask yourself, especially with virtue signaling, is what is the intent? Is it critical thinking, or is it using your emotions? And we saw that. We have seen that over and over again, the use of emotions and the use of crisis in order to push a point, right? And so you bring up Judas. When I saw that too, and I said, "Ooh, this is really difficult to read," when we saw the financial corruption with Peter's Pence. That's exactly what happened. That money was taken, money was stolen.
Yeah, and it's interesting, especially as I read through the document, I kept thinking this over and over and over again, like all these people that the Vatican has brought in to try and tackle this problem of whether it's climate change or COVID or inclusive capitalism or whatever they want to call it, right? They're largely the people that are responsible for a lot of these problems, like a lot of them. Like you want to talk about, poverty and economic disparity between nations, a lot of the big banks that were at this, at some of these states, or even the wealthy athletes and things like that. Like, it just screams of hypocrisy, and they're never going to, it will never be addressed. It'll just be ignored and we'll move on because we're supposed to be good sheep. So that's part of the problem. And I just thought it was interesting that it was the very, number one, the very first thing they talk about is this story about why Judas was upset that they didn't sell the oil, and that's because he's a thief, because he wanted the money for himself. And I'm not saying that that's what the Pope's doing. That's definitely not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that I find it interesting that that was the first statement, and then we go on to talk about what governments can do more, and NGOs need to do more, and outside institutions need to do more, and that we should be living the abilities of the Yes. Yep. So anyway,
and Joey, that's where we're going to go, and we're going to talk about G7, because I think it's that same mentality of virtue signaling. But I would highly recommend those of you who are listening or watching, we don't need to do that. We don't need to manipulate emotion to get a point across. Facts speak for themselves, and Joey is bringing up many facts, many points, there are factual evidence here that those questions ought to be asked, but in a very even-toned way. This is you have to keep coming back and not respond in kind with just emotional rhetoric, because we don't do that well. So we're going to go on to G7 because there's a lot to unpack this week.
Let's get that. Adrian, can we get the clip, that first clip, and then we'll talk about it a little bit?
And for all these issues, what we need is cooperation. And I think it's great to have the U.S. president part of the club and very willing to cooperate. And I think that what you demonstrate is that leadership is partnership. And we do appreciate, and I think we can deliver great things for that.
I think we can do a lot too. The United States, I've said before, we're back. The U.S. is back.
And for all these issues...
So the United States is back, and also we are part of the club, Joey.
Yeah, I mean, we're back to paying for other people's stuff, that's for sure. So that's not very exciting as an American. And the other thing I thought was just weird, back to what club? If you want to talk about politics and everything else, the United States is usually the leader of that particular club, and it has been for quite some time now. So, it's interesting that he kind of took a backseat to all these other foreign leaders and allowed them to say, and he just pretty much nodded and agreed that, it's great to have the United States back, playing for the same team that wants to spend tons of money and make sure that people don't own anything and the Americans are going to pay large chunks of it. So America's back to paying for your stuff. That's what I got out of it.
To build back better actually is the theme, one of the themes that came out of this. The G7 issued a statement, Joey, and our State Department also issued the statement. And I'll just read it because it uses that term. And we were talking before when we were prepping for the show. There are sometimes I really can't stand the themes, but the left does the theme very well. And our president is left leaning, so they issued this statement, and it says
if he leans any harder, he's going to fall over.
The leaders of the Group of Seven met in Cornwall on the 11th through the 13th of June 2021, determined to beat COVID-19 and build back better. We remembered everyone who has been lost to the pandemic and paid tribute to those still striving to overcome it. And then they talk about some of the ways that they're going to, build back better. But I do find it interesting. Again, we're being welcomed back into a club, and that leadership is partnership. And again, our president said we're back from what? I mean, we were leading, even if we didn't agree with how Trump led.
Yeah, I think there's the whole statement, the whole conference was a lot of status quo and pretty much rubber stamping stuff that has existed for a long time. The one interesting thing is that they did call collectively for how this gets implemented remains to be seen, but for an investigation of the origins of COVID-19, which the Chinese government has said that if the United States starts to look into the origins of COVID-19, they should prepare for nuclear war, which I've mentioned before. So the G7 agreed that they need to look into the origins of that. So I don't know if we also need to be preparing for nuclear war by the same logic. So I thought that was pretty interesting. The other things that came out of it were largely, in my opinion, the same type of they talked about climate change and how it's an existential threat, and we need to cut emissions and do the same things that they've been saying forever because the world's going to end, and the timeline just keeps moving to the right a little bit. So there's a lot that happened there. There's a lot that didn't happen there. I know we've got a few more.
No masking. That didn't happen.
Well, yeah, there was a lot of hypocrisy. I mean, they'd mask up and do socially distant photographs and then all hug and shake hands and sit next to one another, and they'd wear masks and then take them off when they sat down because COVID doesn't attack you when you're sitting down. So there was a lot that kind of came out of the G7. There was a lot of nothing at the same time. There was some flubs and some weird things that happened that we'll talk about. After the break, we can jump into it a little bit more. And there's a few more stories we wanted to touch on. So stick around, come back after the break. We're going to keep talking about the G7 and a few other topics that we've got, and then we'll round out the end of the show. So stick around. Thanks for listening.
Many who live the homosexual lifestyle attempt to justify their behavior by saying their same-sex attraction is natural for them. That's to say they didn't choose it. But is this justification reasonable? I answer no, and here's why. First, an individual's inclination or desire can't be the standard for morally evaluating human behavior. Such logic leads to the justification of any behavior, even ones we intuitively recognize as immoral. Second, the objection associates the term natural merely with an individual's tendency, as opposed to tendencies that are common to our nature as human beings. That's to say, those tendencies that belong to our species as such and target objective goods that perfect our nature. An individual's same-sex attraction might be independent of his or her choice, but that doesn't make it natural in the sense of giving moral justification to act on it. I'm Carlo Broussard with a ready reason for Catholic Answers, Catholic.com.
Welcome back to Intersections with Bree Dail and Joey Meugniot. We had a few more moments there, but surprise, we're back. So we've been talking a lot. We talked some church news at the beginning of the show, talked about Cardinal Marx, and then we talked for a while about World Day of the Poor. And we have now transitioned into some of the things that happened in the G7. and what's going to be coming up. I know we've got a climate, I don't know, conference that's going to happen that the Pope's going to attend coming up. We've got NATO and a few other things. So we'll talk about that towards the last couple minutes of the show. But so there is one thing, Bree, that was super new that wasn't something that they had agreed to 50 other times before this, and this was the 15% minimum global corporate tax rate that the G7 has agreed to implement. Now, there's some issues like Ireland is not a fan of that at all, and there's a few other nations in Europe that aren't part of the G7 that are not fans of it because they're still trying to recover. So part of building back better is raising taxes, I guess. So I don't know how that's going to shake out. And a lot of these corporations that are involved in this, I can't imagine are going to be very big fans of a minimum of 15%, when a lot of them are paying zero right now. So was there anything else that you found, aside from some of the masking hypocrisies and things like that, which I thought were funny? It just goes to show you that it's do as I say, not as I do. Rules for thee, but not for me. So what else did you think happened out of there that you wanted to touch on?
Well, I mean, I want to just kind of make a mention that Joe Biden did go to Mass on Sunday, and that was a surprise to those who were in England, in the very small fishing town that they were at. The only one Catholic church with only one Mass per day, as it was listed on its door. I think they also had a Mass on Wednesdays. That was it, one Mass. And because it was such a surprise, with all of the security that goes on behind the scenes to make sure that the parish is safe, to make sure the people who are going to Mass are not carrying weapons, all of that kind of thing. Many of the parishioners weren't able to get to Mass because Joe Biden decided to go to Mass. And
it was a pretty surprising thing to see happen.
Yeah,
so it was a little weird. I mean, I think God was probably surprised as well, but first time for everything, I suppose.
Well, here's the thing: is that we're about to see the USCCB, the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops. They're going to be meeting and discussing the issue behind whether or not Joe Biden and politicians are going to be able to receive the Eucharist publicly, as Joe Biden does often, while continuing to support legislation as he has and very adamantly has on abortion and the testing of medical procedures on aborted fetuses. That has just been lifted again when it was banned during Trump administration. So, this is just another example of the public use of the Mass. And I pray for our president on that. Another thing that I found very interesting, and then we're going to go to Theresa May because she has some pretty poignant statements on the current extension of COVID shutdowns in the UK. But another one of the topics out of the G7 was that the G7 made statements on China and the Uyghurs and Hong Kong and Taiwan, but and China really hasn't responded, and I think that needs to be read in light of whether or not these statements follow through with any action. Now, we know during the Trump administration, action was produced after words were said. And yet that the first thing I saw when reports were coming out that the G7 did speak out, which I applaud them for speaking out on China and Taiwan and Hong Kong and the Uyghurs, but what's going to? I mean, these are the powerful countries, very wealthy countries. Are there going to be any sanctions? Any follow through with this? That's my question at this point.
Absolutely not. That's my hot take. So
yes.
I don't think anything will happen. They're going to talk about it like they always do, and then they've condemned them, and then they'll move on. Because why would they do anything significant to stop any of those things when they're in the positions of power to do it? That's crazy talk, Bree. That's crazy talk. So you can give crazy talk. Well, I was going to say, speaking of crazy talk, let's talk about some not crazy talk from the former prime minister, because I loved this video. I thought it was great. So, Adrian, can you roll that for us, please?
We will not eradicate COVID-19 from the UK. There will not be a time when we can say that there will never be another case of COVID-19 in this country. Secondly, variants will keep on coming. There will be new variants every year. If the government's position is that we cannot open up travel until there are no new variants elsewhere in the world, then we will never be able to travel abroad ever again. And the third fact that the government needs to state much more clearly is that, sadly, people will die from COVID here in the UK in the future, as 10 to 20,000 people do every year from flu. It's incomprehensible, I think, that one of the most heavily vaccinated countries in the world is one that is most reluctant to give its citizens the freedoms those vaccinations should support. We will not eradicate COVID-19 from the UK. There will not be a time when...
That's so powerful, and she's speaking logic. She's speaking logic, Joey, because, and you know, I do find that many of the European countries are saying the same, which is the reason why they're opening up travel. The question is, are they going to close travel again, Joey, when it starts to get colder? And I kind of get this gut feeling that they're going to try. And I don't know if Americans and Europeans are going to allow for that. Why? Because we were talking about the World Day of the Poor and the statement the Pope came out and speaking about individualistic lifestyles and whatnot. But, you know, we're talking about small businesses, right? Small businesses. The economy in Italy is, I'm actually surprised the country is still running because the economy is in shambles and small businesses are barely staying open. We know that that's the case in the United States, and we have a lot more freedoms there to run businesses, to start new businesses. Joey, what's your take in all of this?
So I think that they don't like when people think for themselves. And I think that as long as you go along to get along, just keep doing what they're telling you to do. But the problem is that none of it makes sense, right? So it doesn't pass the smell test. So you think about it for a second, you're like, wait a minute, well, what about that? Just like some of these countries that these G7 leaders are part of, or that they're from, still continue to have some partial lockdowns, curfews, mask mandates. And they were around a bunch of people that are all vaccinated, and they still acted like, and it really was it's mask virtue signaling. It's absolutely crazy to me. They're doing it for the cameras. It's literally for show. It's a dog and pony show. I know that I think the Westminster Kennel Club dog show was last week, and they could have easily confused the G7 with that. So it's all pomp and circumstance, and fluffy little dogs probably would have been more entertaining. So, I think that there's a lot of do as I say, not as I do, rules for thee, not for me. And I think people just globally are getting a little bit tired of it. So, I think what Theresa May had to say is absolutely correct. I think that that's what a lot of people think. She basically said what a lot of people are thinking, like, we're just going to keep doing this forever. If the standard is no COVID infections, like, I guess we'll just be like this forever. And that doesn't make a lot of sense. So, there are a lot of people hurting out there. There's a lot of economic impact that's happened from all of this. And I think they're going to use it as an excuse. So I agree with you that I think they're going to use it as an excuse to continue pushing new government spending programs. They're going to try to tie it to a lot of things. And when that runs out, they'll move on to something else. So,
yes,
and you've seen that now already.
Actually said that from the World Economic Forum. He has said that from the beginning. So, again, it goes back to critical thinking, which I think people are starting to really jump on, especially with the crisis manipulation, because we do know that the crisis exists. We do know that there are variants. We also know that there are concerns. I mean, there are reports out, medical reports out of Israel, where, vaccinated children, which Israel ensured, like mass vaccinations, vaccinated children, specifically young men, are seeming to develop some heart issues, which now is being studied by all of the major bioethicists as well as medical professionals who help develop these vaccines. This is part of, having to deal with developing medications. Sometimes we just don't anticipate what could potentially be, a fallout from taking a vaccine and developing medical, just like, certain virologists may have not anticipated a fallout in studying gain of function. These are real questions that we have to ask. Science is based on the physical knowledge of things, not often the philosophical things. It's the physical knowledge of things, which is the reason why we have science consistently developing, which is the reason why we need to focus on fact and evidence, wherever that leads us. So, Joey, any last thoughts?
Yeah, so a few, always. So I think there's a lot that we just don't know right now, especially when it comes to the ramifications for this the global vaccination campaign. And I think we'll find out more moving forward. And I'm curious to see where it all goes. I think for news coming up, over the next, now it's already happening. So they moved from G7 to round out kind of our G7 talk. They finished the G7, put out a statement. It's up on Bree's Twitter. If you haven't checked it out, go check it out. Otherwise, they've moved on to the NATO summit. So a lot of those same countries have moved on to the NATO summit, where they're going to be tackling climate change and Russia, are the imminent threats of our day. So there's a lot of talk going to be going on around that. So we'll probably have some news to report on that for you guys next week. And I know that there's also...
Right, and Joey, there is conversation that is happening behind the scenes in the press pool. We don't know whether or not the Pope is going to meet with President Biden. There was suggestion that was going to take place. It's now being said we don't know. We don't have any indication on the schedule. And so we'll have to come back to you and let you know.
Well, they've got the climate change conference where they can bump heads and shake hands and stuff, so they might be able to wing that conversation to that. So, but that's about all the time we have today. We got under about a minute or so. So we touched on a ton of topics. We talked about the church. We talked about G7. We talked about COVID once again, China, a lot of things. It was kind of jumped all over the place. So stick around, come back and see us next week, where we will continue to give you some great analysis on exciting topics. My name's Joey Meugniot, and I'm joined also by Bree Dail, and this is Intersections, and we will see you next week.